Hey up duckies and welcome to Sam Not So Wise. My name is Sam and today I'm doing my first video in a long-term series of videos where I talk about books, authors, series, what have you, that I consider to be underhyped or underrated. So those series that don't get a lot of attention on YouTube, at least in the corners that I watch, and those that I consider to be slightly underrated, and I will big them up and let you know about them. So with much further ado, let's start with some sci-fi. Now, if you watch my top 10 sci-fi and fantasy series video, my first ever video, if you haven't, I'll put it in the description so you can watch it, but if you have, then you know that The Culture by Iain M Banks is one of my all-time favourite series. And I really do not understand why this isn't talked about very much on YouTube. There are a few YouTubers here and there who read a book here, read a book there, they've read a couple, two or three, but nobody's really delving into the series. There was Moid at Media Death Cult who read the whole series as a read-along and it was amazing, but for some reason he's taken most of his videos down, so you can't even find those anymore. So I want to shed some light on what I consider to be one of the best. So one thing I find really interesting about this series is even though it's 10 books, they are all standalone books. The stories are self-contained and they don't really link up with the other books in the series. There are small little nuggets, little Easter eggs here and there to keep you interested if you've read the others, but really you can read them in any order generally. So they're really useful as kind of palate cleansers, if you like, if you're reading a humongous series and you want something in between books. Although calling it a palate cleanser is a little misleading because they can be quite heavy and not super easy to read. Some of them are, but not all of them. So you make that decision, but they are all standalones. So I did actually read them all in chronological order, and that begins with Consider Fleabas. However, I would not actually recommend you start with that book because it is the weakest in the series and was kind of an experimentation for Iain Banks. Iain Banks wrote a lot of contemporary fiction as well, so non-sci-fi books, and this was his first sci-fi book he ever wrote. And it's not the cleanest of all of the books. It's still good and worth reading. I do recommend it, but I recommend you start with the second book, which is The Player of Games. This one is a lot smoother and please start with this one if you're going to read this series. So one thing I find super interesting about this series is that it is based on a utopian society. Now, I can't think of many other examples of books that are utopias. Maybe Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke, but I haven't even read that book, so these are the only ones I've really read. So if you have any recommendations of utopian books, I would love to hear them. Please comment and let me know. So yes, this is kind of a rarity within the sci-fi fantasy world that this is utopian. This post-scarcity society is humongous. It is galaxy spanning, so it really is large scale, and that's what gives it the space opera moniker, if you will. And a huge aspect of this society is it is basically run by AI. There are a lot of humanoid species within this society, billions and billions and billions and billions of them, but the real key of the society is what they call the AI minds, these supercomputers that control basically everything. If you want your tiny little mind exploding, then look no further at the epic scale of the world building. Not just is it galaxy spanning, which is obviously huge already, but the colossal scale of this society is really mind-blowing. So the ships in this, you have to read it to really feel it, but they are humongous. They have whole worlds that are habitated. They have these things called orbitals, which are hundreds of kilometers long. So if you want awe-inspiring world building of humongous proportions, then this is the one for you. The world building is also expanded in terms of aliens within this galaxy. So the culture is mostly humanoid and the AIs, but it does involve other species as well, but where it really gets fun is when they travel to other societies, civilizations, and there are just many types of aliens, and the imagination of this man was unparalleled. I often find it difficult to believe some aliens in sci-fi books could actually be true, but in these ones, I really believe that these could be real, and he really does his work in making them feel like a real civilization that were based on the world that they grew up in and any kind of features their alien bodies may have. So these things really affect their culture, and then you see the interactions between the two cultures and how crazy that would be, and it's fascinating. I find the thematic work in these books absolutely fascinating, and basically a lot of it focuses on what would people do in a utopia, what motivates people in a utopia, what do they want, and you do follow a lot of hedonism, so a lot of people who are following the pursuit of pleasure, but really that's just that's not what we focus on. The main focus is whether the culture, this huge society, should interfere in other societies or not. So many of the plots follow the culture or some agents within the culture finding a society or having heard of a society, civilization, who are not within the culture. And the question is whether to bring them into the fold. Do they subtly alter their civilization to slowly bring them up to the level where they will be okay to join the society because they're not very technologically advanced, morally advanced. They very much are kind of find themselves as morally superior to a lot of cultures, which is an interesting question. Or do they just leave them to themselves because they are too barbarous to even be considered to join the society? The people that engage in these questionable moral missions are kind of outsiders within the society. So we're following a very small section of the society, and they are called contact. And so it's in the name, they are the people that make contact with other civilizations. So the people who aren't really bothered in the pursuit of pleasure, they try and join contact, but it's very difficult to get in. This is kind of a branch of the culture who can be considered maybe the governors of the culture as a whole, even though there aren't governors, but really they do kind of hold a lot of the power. Even further to this are the branch that are called special circumstances. They're extremely mysterious. They get up to some dirty deeds, some spying. They're the ones who have any kind of armored spaceships, because the cultures say they don't have any warships, but oh, of course they do. And they do the secret missions. They're basically the James Bond characters of this society. Special circumstances employ tactics that the average culture citizen would find absolutely horrifying, but there's a justification of the greater good. So there's a lot of questioning of whether it's right to do something nasty to save a lot of lives and that kind of lovely stuff. I would be remiss not to mention the humour in this series, because Iain M Banks has an absolutely wonderful British dry humour. So if that's your thing, then you will enjoy a lot of it in here. Let's quickly talk about some key books in the series. You have The Player of Games, as I mentioned earlier, quite classically structured, more settled than the first book, and really focuses on an interesting alien culture and a man who just loves to play games, but his playing games will drastically affect that new civilization. We have The Use of Weapons, which might be my favourite sci-fi book of all time. I don't want to say much because it would spoil a lot, but this book has the most fascinating structure where there are two stories and they go in opposite time directions, one going forward, one going backwards. Obviously they meet in the middle at some point, and how he implements this is just so good. Accession is basically 90% focused on the AI minds, and it really expands how the civilization of the culture deals with outside civilizations and species that are considered of equal level of technology. So it's a really interesting look at how this utopian society deals with other huge civilizations. Hydrogen Sonata is the final book in the series and deals with the thought of sublimation. So that's basically when you become no longer made of matter and you exist in a different plane. And it's very philosophical and heavy, but it is really, truly fascinating. So yes, if you haven't explored the culture and you're a huge sci-fi fan, you have to read it. It is absolutely essential sci-fi reading. All 10 books are brilliant, obviously with varying levels, but I think he's like a writer's writer. A lot of sci-fi writers really consider Banks to be influential to them, so please give it a go. Next, I want to give a hopefully quicker shout out to a trilogy by Margaret Atwood, and it's called the Mad Adam trilogy, which is Oryx and Crake, The Year of the Flood, check it's right, and Mad Adam. Now this is a dystopian and apocalyptic series. So I released a video recently about dystopian and apocalyptic and the differences, and I cut out a section of the video because it was getting too long, where sometimes a dystopian society can lead to an apocalyptic society, and this is one of those. I'll link the video in the description. This series is environmental sci-fi, so it's basically a huge old warning of what might happen if we play around with nature too much and we don't respect it. So people who are interested in nature, global warming, genetics, that kind of stuff, it's super interesting for those themes. Talking of books that are kind of standalone, the first 2 books in this series feel like standalones a lot because they focus on smaller groups of characters that are not initially connected, but they do end up meeting each other towards the end of the second book. So the first series, Oryx and Crake, it focuses on basically one character and his interactions with some strange beings. And you find out what these strange beings are. And The Year of the Flood focuses on a community in this post-apocalyptic society, which are basically focusing on living together and surviving this new world, but with a lot of respect to nature. As I said before, this is apocalyptic fiction, so the current timeline is in an apocalyptic world after a huge man-made plague, basically. But both the first books have a lot of flashbacks, basically the people coming to terms with what happened in a previously dystopian society that led up to an apocalypse. Book 3, Mad Adam, now our characters are all together, and this book is very much about rebuilding, which is classic post-apocalyptic. And it's very much about rebuilding with respect to nature and making sure that we don't screw things up all over again, and fighting off the remaining evils who are taking advantage of this crappy old land. It is perhaps the generally least liked book in the series, but I think it is a solid ending. As I said, this world is fairly self-contained, not a large cast of characters, so it is fairly easy reading in terms of that. It's very depressing stuff, but it is kind of a combination of a character-focused book, the relationships within this small society that is rebuilding, but obviously it is very heavily focused on the themes of respecting nature and not screwing things up again. If you saw my top 10, you will realise that this didn't even make it into the honourable mentions, as it is not one of my favourite series of all time, but it is very good. It's a solid trilogy. They are not too long, especially if you're a normal sci-fi fantasy book reader. These can be whacked out fairly quickly, and I find it I always find it really interesting when mostly contemporary writers write something in a sci-fi world, and I think Margaret Atwood did a really good job, and I don't think I've seen one single person talking about it. And the first two books especially are really good examples of post-apocalyptic and dystopian fiction and deserve to be in the conversation. So that's it for the first installment of Underhyped, Underrated book series and authors. Have you read any of these, and would you agree that they're underhyped and underrated? Are there any that you think are underhyped and underrated? Let me know, I would love to hear. But for now, please subscribe to my channel, leave a comment, all of that good stuff, and I'll see you in another video soon. Goodbye.